So we talked to Jeff that day. He agreed, and so here he is with When Wagoneers Roamed the Earth. And you're on, Jeff. Yeah, they're over in the corner. They might well be. But actually, Jeff, you can see it really well here. I don't know if that. Yeah, you can see it really good. That's good right there, buddy. Perfect.
Can't see, so. Hello, everybody. My name is Jeff Nelson, and I live in Toledo. First, I want to start by thanking Willys Reunion and Bob Christie for inviting me to speak, and my friend Greg and all those who helped set up the Wagoneer history display. I'm here to talk about my love affair with the Jeep Wagoneer. Growing up, I never cared about cars or trucks. My first passion was American Indians, and then Patriots, Knights, Romans, and by high school, World War II stuff. Certainly I thought World War II Jeeps were very cool, but my interest extended only as far as making plastic models. I've always collected stuff. As a kid, it was baseball cards, comic books, and wacky package stickers. Later, it was beer cans, beer trays, and Coca-Cola. Then I started to collect bubble gum and chewing gum, and even though I don't collect that actively anymore, I'm told I have the largest collection in the country. In my 30s and 40s, I went crazy collecting Jeep Wagoneer stuff, including all these ads and dealer brochures here. For the last 15 years, my main collecting passion has been Imperial German uniforms and children's military picture books from 1870 to 1918. So clearly there's an obsessive and completist component to my personality. The Jeep Wagoneer and I both came out in 1962, but it was not until age 29 that I really paid any attention to them. This is the earliest picture of me with a Wagoneer at age 14, when my family had just come home from living in Afghanistan and Iran prior to that. That's me on the far right. My brothers and cousins and I are gathered around a 63 to 65 Rhino Grill Wagoneer. I fell in love with my first Jeep 25 years ago in 1994. It was parked 1 block from my house. It was a 1976 Wagoneer in reef green metallic. It had been used as a snow plow and was pretty rusty, but it was green, my favorite color, and it was so great looking. Only years later did I come to appreciate the deft touch of Brooks Stevens and how his brilliant design elevated the Wagoneer above its many contemporaries. All I knew was that this old Jeep was the coolest combination of station wagon and truck, and its rugged simplicity reminded me strongly of Tonka toys. And one thing that's funny is that Tonka toys, which have been left out in the sandbox, rust out in exactly the same areas as actual the rocker panels, the rear fenders, and the bottom of the tailgate. At some point I asked the owner of the 76 Wagoneer if he wanted to sell it. He hemmed and hawed, but eventually agreed. As naive as I was about cars, I knew I should get it checked out first. My mechanic gave me a summary of what was wrong with it, and he warned me not to buy the Wagoneer even if they offered it to me for free. So it bummed me out, but I took his advice, which is why it was so incredibly frustrating that when a woman in the neighborhood bought the Jeep and drove it with impunity for the next 2 years. It really pained me to see somebody else driving this cool vehicle, and I told her to let me know if she ever wanted to sell it. A few months later, she called and said the transmission had given out and asked if I still wanted to buy it. So going against my mechanic's stern warning, I bought it for $400 and had AMCO fix the transmission. Here's a photo of me with my new giddy with excitement. Over the next decade, I ended up putting $17,000 into it, and that's in 1994 dollars. But you would never know it from looking at it.
It sounds like a Dodge trust.
25 years later, it's as rusty as the day I bought it. I've certainly learned some things over the years about fixing Wagoneers, but I will never be as mechanically inclined as my brother. A couple years after I bought my first Wagoneer, it started having carburetor and engine troubles, and I made the mistake of taking it to a local shade tree mechanic. He could never quite fix it, and eventually he said I needed a new engine. Later I realized all I probably needed was a new exhaust manifold. So this is when the total nightmare began. That's Big Bob on the right. Big Bob put in a rebuilt 360 engine, but he clearly did not have much experience with four-wheel drive vehicles. After he was done installing the engine, he started it up and it ran nicely. But as soon as he shifted it into gear, we heard the most horrible sound, like 10,000 BBs hitting a gigantic cookie sheet. The transmission was totally messed up, and that's when I made my second mistake. I took the Wagoneer back to AMCO Transmissions. We got the transmission fixed, but something was clearly wrong. Driving 15 miles an hour sounded like you were going 60 in first gear. The AMCO franchise owner said I should take it to a different AMCO location who had more experience working with Jeeps. Before I had it towed, I called this other AMCO owner. I said, do you have experience with quadra-track Jeep Wagoneers? And that means full-time four-wheel drive. And they said, don't worry, Mr. Nelson, we've done literally thousands of these. They ended up having the Jeep for 99 days. So you can imagine I was quite mad, so I finally had it towed away, and I towed it to a local Jeep dealer. I had always avoided going to a Jeep dealer because getting stuff fixed there was always so much more expensive. But boy, is it worth paying people who know what they're doing. Bo, who became my go-to mechanic for the next several years, fixed my Wagoneer in a day and a half. He said the problem was the low range reduction unit, and he took one off of a Jeep in his front yard. He had worked on Jeeps for over 30 years, and I was very sad when he finally retired. One time when I complained to Bo about the poor gas mileage I'd gotten on a recent road trip, he said, she loves the pump. To improve the performance and reliability of my Wagoneer, I enlisted my brother Brian's help. He did some research, and since my Jeep's AMC 360 V8 engine was used in so many vehicles for so many years, there's lots of great aftermarket stuff available for hot rodders. So he ordered the stuff we needed from Summit Racing Equipment, and I drove the 8 hours up to Martha's Vineyard. Over the course of the weekend, Brian utterly transformed my Wagoneer. I love this picture of Brian removing the old manifold. With me helping where I could, he installed a new Edelbrock intake manifold and a 4-barrel Edelbrock carburetor and a Mallory breakerless magnetic distributor. The difference was remarkable. Not only had my Wagoneer been rendered unstoppable, my mileage went from 10 miles per gallon to 15. In addition to getting rather poor mileage with their big V8 engines, Wagoneers became bogged down with more and more emission systems over the years. We vintage Jeep owners here in Ohio are very lucky to have such lax emission standards. Not so great for the environment, but very helpful for people trying to keep old vehicles on the road. In the Washington, D.C. area where I used to live, D.C. and neighboring states, Virginia and Maryland, all have very strict safety and emissions standards. Your vehicle has to pass safety and emissions tests every year, and they're very strict. My dentist was a big car collector, and he knew of my passion for Wagoneers. He told me what he had done one year when he knew there was no way his Grand Wagoneer was going to pass emissions. He installed a small oxygen tank with a tube leading into the tailpipe. Incredibly dangerous, of course, to have pure oxygen blowing into a red-hot tailpipe. Right before going to get his vehicle inspected, he turned it on. When the test was complete and the Wagoneer had passed with flying colors, the official was in disbelief at how clean the tailpipe was. He said he'd never seen My dentist just kept a straight face and says, yeah, I keep it tuned up regularly. Over the next 5 years, I became more and more interested in Wagoneers and started taking photos whenever I saw them in New England and the Outer Banks of North Carolina, California, Oregon, and Washington State. In 1999, I bought my second Wagoneer after seeing an ad in Hemmings Motor News. I doubt there are many of you here who do not know the importance of Hemmings to car collecting, but before the internet, this was the best way to buy and sell vehicles and parts. On the same page, you can see an ad for Wagon Master in Texas showing that 8 years after Wagoneer production had stopped, demand was still strong and its status as a collector car was just beginning. The advertisement I saw was for a rust-free 1963 Wagoneer, originally from California. Only years later did I learn that it was the 40th two-wheel drive Wagoneer ever produced. So that's the Wagoneer down near Atlanta. The seller told me that the seller said that he'd been told that the Wagoneer had been repainted with the cream lacquer paint to be in a Beach Boys video of some sort, but I don't know if there's any truth to that story. I flew to Atlanta to see the Wagoneer, and $3,800, it was mine. Here's a photo of the 63 at Toledo Jeep Fest last year. That same year, I went with my girlfriend Christine to visit a junkyard in North Carolina owned by her uncle. Here's a picture of Christine driving my 76 Wagoneer. Her uncle's junkyard had a number of old Wagoneers and Cherokees, and we had the run of the place. I was in heaven. They were very accommodating, and I got many doors, hoods, body panels, and tons of smaller parts, all for free. And here's a picture of us having a romantic picnic. This picture shows Christine at the bottom of a grassy hill near Oak Ridge, Tennessee. You can't tell from the photo, but Christine is very angry at me. There had just been just enough of a snowstorm to make the roads a little slippery. I was already taking this into account, going just under the speed limit, especially since I knew my tires were pretty bald. We decided to get something to eat and started to exit the highway, coming from the same direction as the trucks in the photo. The exit turned out to have quite a curve, and I could tell immediately upon exiting that I was going at least 5 or 10 miles an hour too fast for the curve. I knew between the snow and my tires, if I turned the wheel to follow the curve, or even tapped my brakes to slow down, we would either lose control and fishtail or roll over. So within 2 seconds, I made the command decision to just drive straight off the exit ramp. Boy, were we lucky there was no fence, no ditches, no trees. We just sailed off the exit and went down and down a nicely graded grassy hill, and eventually ended up right near our dining destination. Both of us were a bit shaken, but Christine was livid. She said, "You could have killed us!" I didn't disagree, we were lucky to be alive, but I thought I deserved credit for keeping control of the vehicle. We ate most of our meal at Waffle House in silence. But all was forgiven as we made our way back home. I remember clearly one night in Virginia when we were driving through torrential rain. It was late at night and we decided to get off for the night. We ended up in a deserted campground surrounded by tall pine trees. It was pitch dark and the incessant rain on the steel roof of the Wagoneer was deafening, especially since I had no headliner or insulation. It was extremely romantic, and the roomy interior of my full-size Jeep proved most useful. 2 years later, I was dating a girl named Claire in San Francisco. Up until 2001, I'd intentionally steered clear of this new internet thing, including email. I knew that I'd probably go crazy on eBay like a kid in a candy store. 18 years later, I can confirm that eBay is a very dangerous place for me. Claire showed me how easy it was to find Wagoneer stuff on eBay, and I was hooked. I joined eBay so I could bid on my third Wagoneer, a beautiful 1967 in Empire Blue, also from California. I was elated when I won the auction. The Wagoneer had been owned by the wife of an engineer who made certain modifications and kept meticulous records. Of all my Wagoneers, this is the one that turns women's heads. Here's a picture of it at Jeep Fest last year. On my last visit to Claire, we drove to the most amazing Jeep junkyard, J&W Auto Wreckers in Antelope, California. I had never seen anything like it. It's gigantic. They had acres and acres of rust-free Jeeps. There must have been more than 50 Wagoneers. You weren't supposed to take pictures, but I just could not, that's me, could not resist taking photos. It was quite amazing. I assume they still have a lot, but that was 18 years ago. That's clear. About a year later, I bought several Wagoneer parts on eBay from a guy in Washington State who said he pulled them off a 1967 Glacier White Wagoneer in a junkyard in Spokane. I asked whether the interior was still in place, and he said yes, and it seemed to be in decent shape. I said, well, can you take some pictures? He said, I don't have a camera. So I bought a disposable camera and mailed it to him. And the next time he went to the junkyard, he took a whole roll of photos and mailed it back to me. So I immediately got them developed. And I saw that the interior was nearly perfect. It was all the door panels and the front and rear seats, just all perfect. So I immediately emailed him and said, buy the entire interior for me, please. And a week later, he emailed back and said he wanted the junkyard, but the Wagoneer had already been sent to the crusher. So you can imagine my frustration, because it was a beautiful interior. Things ended with Claire, but my love affair with Wagoneers had just begun. In short order, I had bought 2 more Wagoneers on eBay. The first was a 1971 with low miles in avocado metallic mist, shown here with me and my girlfriend Anne. It was a respectful amount of time between Claire and Anne. It had been a woman's island car on a small island off the coast of Maine. 18 years later, the interior still has a wonderful aromatic smell from the pine needles in the air ducts. And while I'm sure this represents a fire hazard, I think it's worth it. And here's that same Jeep last year at Jeep Fest. My next purchase was a 1991 final edition, which is one of the last 500 or 100 or whatever, in Hunter Green. I bought it from a seller in Blue Balls, Pennsylvania. Shortly after that, I bought a 1980 4-door Cherokee Chief from a friend, and there it is at Jeep Fest last year. And the last Jeep I bought was a 1967 panel delivery truck. It had been used by, I bought it from Jim Barsky in Colorado, and it was used by the U.S. Army as a radio truck. And for those of you that don't know, the back, it's very different because the back doors open like barn doors instead of the glass tailgate, which is forever a problem. So my interest in collecting Jeep Wagoneer and Jeep signs really took off after buying my second Wagoneer when the seller gave me an original 1963 Wagoneer dealer brochure. Over the past 19 years, I've put together what I'm pretty sure is the biggest collection of Wagoneer literature in the world. I'd be happy to be proven wrong about that, but I was fortunate to start collecting when there was still a lot of original material for sale, such as materials gathered by other auto literature collectors in the 60s and 70s, and before an entire new wave of nostalgia for the Wagoneer began to sweep the country. It's crazy the twists and turns that life can take. I put together my first display of Wagoneer literature for a 2002 gathering in Ouray, Colorado, commemorating the 40th anniversary of the J Series. The event was being held on my 40th birthday, so I had to go. I put together 10 panels of Wagoneer ads and brochures sized to fit between the wheel wells of my 91 Grand Wagoneer. My friend Paula and I drove out to Colorado, and we stopped in Toledo to see the old Jeep plant. several months earlier, my ex-girlfriend Claire had given me an article about a big industrial design exhibit at the Toledo Museum of Art, which included a nice Jeep or two. So even though we had missed seeing this exhibit, we visited the museum and were really impressed with their world-class collection. While I was there, I asked a young woman a question that I had asked in many different cities over the years in my search for a big, affordable, cheap Victorian. I said, are there any cheap Victorian houses in Toledo? And she looked at me like I was kidding, and she walked us to the front steps of the museum and pointed and said, the Old West End. So Paul and I drove through the neighborhood, and our jaws were just dropping. One, oh my God, after another. It turns out that Toledo has a large historic district, which is considered to be the largest contiguous neighborhood of Victorian, Edwardian, and arts and crafts houses east of the Mississippi, which is quite a claim if true. So just block after block of amazing houses. Everyone is different, and by Washington, D.C. standards, incredibly affordable. So 1 year later, I decided to return to Toledo and look at houses for sale, including the Tillinghast Willys house. Mr. Tillinghast, a licorice powder magnate, went broke building a gorgeous Tudor home, and later the builder took over the house. Later the builder traded the home to John North Willis for 12 cars. I didn't end up buying that house, but it's pretty cool that I can look out my window and see the house of the founder of Willis Overland. And if anybody lives in the area and is interested in touring the Tillinghast Willis house, it's going to be open to the public along with several other amazing houses during the Old West End Festival on June 1st and 2nd. It took me 6 months to pack up and make the move from Arlington, including driving 5 20-foot trucks full of stuff and driving and trucking all my Wagoneers back to the city in which they were built. Here's a photo of a very exhausted Jeff with the last load strapped to the roof of my 71 Wagoneer. And just for fun, here's pictures of me and my wonderful parents. The Wagoneer history display I put together in 2002 had been well received, but after showing it twice, I just stuck in the corner and it gathered dust. I continued collecting Wagoneer literature and Jeep dealership signs, and I wished I had time and resources to pick up where others had left off in trying to establish a Jeep museum. I was too busy with projects to participate in the first Toledo Jeep Fest in 2016. Of course, the majority of the Jeeps in the parade and on display were Wranglers and CJs. When it was announced the Toledo Jeep Fest in 2018 would be a much bigger 3-day event, I knew that I'd never forgive myself if I didn't make some contribution. So with the help of 2 friends, I put together a big Wagoneer themed event, which I called When Wagoneers Roamed the Earth. I envisioned full-size Jeeps lining both sides of Huron Street in downtown Toledo in front of my friend's business. I started with a photo of Huron Street, and then I photographed high-quality HO scale Wagoneers and Gladiators one at a time. And then I added those to the picture of the street. And so each Jeep, for anybody who knows anything about Photoshop, each Jeep ended up being a different layer in Photoshop, so it was a huge file by the time I was finished. Up until the morning of the event, I was really worried that we wouldn't have enough actual Wagoneers, Cherokees, and Gladiators lined up on the street to merit much excitement. But the weather was perfect, and apparently word had spread, and it was really exciting to have full-size Jeeps, which had been in the big Jeep parade, pull over and join us after the parade was finished. So in the end, it ended up looking pretty much exactly like the meeting. And so those are all my Jeeps from left to right: 63, 67, 71, 76, 80, and 91. And so it's just pretty cool because it ended up looking exactly like my little mock-up. And here are just that was a beautiful one that came down from Michigan. These are just some other full-size Jeeps that were at Jeep Fest last year. Alrighty, so the real focus of my attention for Jeep Fest was to expand my Wagoneer history display. It took many months and lots of money to design a display that was 4 times as big as the one I'd done 16 years earlier. When putting together this greatly expanded display, I marveled once again at how cool it was to see the same exact vehicle, except for a couple changes in headlights, grille, and the trim, advertised all through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The changing styles in illustration, photography, typography, copywriting, and marketing all helped give the viewer a real sense of American culture at that point. As we chose and arranged ads and brochures on the display panels, I wondered aloud to my friend Amy if Jeep itself had all this material. She didn't even hesitate, and she said, "No way." And many others have echoed that thought. From the 1970s onwards, Jeep has been an odd combination of cash cow and poor stepchild, passed from owner to owner over the years. This has resulted in extremely poor stewardship of Jeep's storied history. It's incredibly sad to think of all that has been lost over the years, much of it intentionally thrown in dumpsters by penny-pinching lackeys at Chrysler, who are eager to downsize and reconfigure their auto plants. Several years ago, Chrysler held a Jeep History Appreciation Day at the old Willys Overland plant, at which they imploded 2 of the 3 remaining smokestacks, one of which had Overland called out in bricks. Gee, thanks, Chrysler. It was heartbreaking and showed that nothing had been learned in the decades since the incredibly sad and short-sighted dynamiting of the original Willys Overland Administration Building in 1979. It's quite pathetic how Americans generally do not seem to care about what little architectural heritage we have. I'm glad there's at least no shortage of individuals who treasure America's automotive history. What is sorely needed is a proper Jeep museum, ideally in Toledo. So now, briefly, history of the Wagoneer. In November 1962, Kaiser Willys introduced the Wagoneer, replacing the Jeep station wagon, which had been produced from 1946 until 1962. Both were designed by Brooks Stevens. The Wagoneer is considered to be the first sport utility vehicle, and along with its twin Gladiator pickup truck, was the first 4-wheel drive vehicle offered with an automatic transmission. It was an instant hit and provided steady sales for Willys, Kaiser, AMC Renault, and Chrysler until production ceased in 1991. The Cherokee was introduced in 1973, which was essentially a 2-door Wagoneer with a 6-cylinder engine. They costed a little less and they had sportier graphics. To make things even more confusing, they later sold a 4-door version as well. In 1984, Chrysler introduced the downsized Cherokee, at which point the full-size Wagoneer was renamed the Grand Wagoneer. Marketing for the Wagoneer initially skewed towards doctors and sportsmen. Here's a typical ad showing the Wagoneer being used on a ranch, but just the copy is so funny. It says, can a station wagon be beautiful and dutiful? And then, beautiful, dutiful Jeep Wagoneer. So kind of goofy, certainly. And they but they're basically highlighting the 4-wheel drive capabilities with its sophisticated styling. And throughout the 60s, there were ads pointing out that Wagoneers were so easy to drive that even women could handle them. Even women were amazed how well they'd handle. The Wagoneer was offered with a skinny faux wood grain panel starting in the 1970s, and with various levels of fanciness, such as the Super Wagoneer, Laredo, and Wagoneer Limited. By the mid to late 80s, bare bones models became a thing of the past. In its quest to retain market share against an increasing number of 4-wheel drive vehicles, Chrysler increasingly focused on the luxury aspect of the Grand Wagoneer. Everything became cushier and fancier, options became standard, and the Wagoneer was increasingly sold as a classy upscale vehicle. By 1984, when it was renamed Grand Wagoneer, all vehicles had the large wood grain panels, and the vehicle had become thoroughly sissified. All ads from the mid to late 80s feature well-to-do people at the country club, or people golfing, yachting, playing polo, trailering their racehorses, and traversing their large ranches. All right, so now quickly, here are some of my favorite ads. This is, I think, the first Wagoneer brochure. for sure. And tell me if I'm going too fast. And that's like the whole Jeep lineup. And then this, again, with the sort of cheesy, slow copywriting, but classic duty built for duty, classic duty built for duty. I love this annual corporate report for Dana from '63, but to me, they're just some pretty great looking vehicles on the top stand there. And this one is really funny. This is Ludum Fidum, which they just totally made up. It's like in Latin, a diagnosis for professional people. So Ludum Fidum apparently means fun dependable, which is, so the Jeep Wagoneer is fundamentally fun dependable. And then I've always loved this shot, the hot new action look in there, even to the campers. And I love this one's, to me she looks exactly like Andy Griffith's wife. But I just love how the kids are, the whole point of the ad is how safe they are, and they're standing up in those seats. And then I like this one. This is from Switzerland, and it's the Ideale Schleppfahrzeuge, which is ideal towing vehicles. And that speaks for itself. And this is seriously the cheesiest of all the slogans they ever had. It's obviously just a play on the iron fist and a velvet glove, but it's just something just kind of ribald and gross about. And then this is when the Cherokee was introduced in '73. And it's really hard for me to decide because I love all the periods, but my favorite period for Jeeps is really '74 to '78. Probably because that was my first one, but I just love the grills and the colors. And somebody told me that somebody recently had this exact pickup truck. So that's the grill that I like the most. Here's another ad for the Cherokee. Cherokee kept this grill for a long time. Not to bore you, but this was the grill for the Wagoneer from '66 to '69, but then the Cherokee just kept it forever. So this is my first Jeep, and this is my favorite. I just think it's just wonderful, and doesn't that look just like a Tonka toy? I mean, and that's a British one. British ad. And actually, who has that here? Is whoever has that? This was in the parking lot today. That exact vehicle. I was really excited to see that. Oh, and this one, I think this one's hilarious. So in regular magazines, you had make sure you're serious if you're going to buy a Cherokee, and then if you bought Playboy, then it was make damn sure you're serious. And I just think that's such a gorgeous photo of the yellow pickup truck. I wish you could see some. I just think that's great. This is the ugliest one of all the Jeep ads I've ever collected. It's just total lazy new wave mid '80s graphics. Just so bad. And then so these are I think some pretty clever ones towards the very end. Although actually, no, this would have been '84 because they only had the downsized Wagoneer like that first year, I think. But they're still kind of clever. Oh, yep, you were supposed to see that one yet. So there was a great article published just as the Wagoneer was being phased out. It was written by two authors with opposing viewpoints. One of them said, "What a dinosaur! What a gas guzzler! It's totally outdated styling. I can't what's taken them so long, to stop production? And the other author said, what a classic, how can you improve upon perfection? The Chrysler are idiots for discontinuing production. It was really ironic that immediately after the Wagoneer ended its impressive 28-year run, sales of SUVs from domestic and foreign automakers skyrocketed. I think the timelessness of the Wagoneer is increasingly borne out by its die-hard fan base. A remarkable 28 years after production ceased, Grand Wagoneers appear in an endless parade of magazines and catalogs, TV commercials, and movies as a lifestyle indicator. Fiat Chrysler is apparently going to bring back the Wagoneer badge, but I fear it will look like a streamlined sneaker with only hints of what made Brooks Stevens' creation so wonderful. In closing, I can say with certainty that there's a downside to owning a fleet of vehicles and not having the time or money to tend to them all. Here you see the fate of my first Wagoneer when I let the Ivy get out of control one year. I've also learned that women are more likely to be attracted to a man with one vehicle that runs than to a man with 7 vehicles, none of which are running. I know I'll have to face facts at some point and sell most of my Wagoneers and perhaps some of my other collections. I already know how painful it will be deciding which ones to sell. I would love to think that perhaps one or two of them might end up in a Jeep museum someday, but if not, I'll at least make sure they go to people who will love and appreciate them as I have and take care of them for another 25 years. So thanks very much for listening, and thanks again to Willys Reunion for having me.
Thank you, Jeff. We were amazed in the back. We didn't know you were a ladies' man like that. New Jeep, new girl. Yeah, right, yeah. So, in closing, I just want to thank everybody for coming. I know I speak for everybody who works on this, that whenever we see you guys in the parking lot, getting together, meeting new friends, meeting up with old friends, laughing and working on transmissions or whatever, it really makes it all worthwhile. So we really appreciate you guys coming. We try to keep it interesting with people like Jeff, so we got to figure out what we want to do next year. And until then, we will see you guys.